I've mentioned the terrible and surprising effects of chemotherapy more than once, and the root problem is that it causes immunosenescence. This is a large part of why cancer comes back. It's not metastasis, but the damage to the immune system itself, including the critical T cells which are made in the thymus and are critical in fighting cancer and autoimmune disease. Chemotherapy is not the only medication or chemical that can damage white blood cells, and as we age, they accumulate more and more damage. White blood cells are also damaged by glycation from a high carb diet, especially due to dietary fructose, and also fructose, which is produced in the liver itself when you're metabolically unhealthy. Thankfully, there are steps that can be taken to reverse this process. That's a good thing. Otherwise, it won't be long before you get some very bad news from your doctor.
Well, I really should be going. Got to tell the family that the patient didn't make it. It's the hardest part of being a doctor. I think.
I got a comment about a past video saying there's no reason you would need to fast in the winter, and the hunting season is in the fall and winter, so therefore it makes no sense you'd have to fast in the winter time. And all you need to be perfectly healthy is a carnivore diet. I don't know why I get some of these wacky comments from carnivores. Maybe some of them are fake carnivores like Saladino who want to spread misinformation. Or maybe it's even vegans pretending to be carnivores, who knows?
You need professional help, son.
He's getting it, it's not working.
Regardless, it should be pretty obvious why there's less game in winter and why hunting is typically in the fall. In the spring and summer, there's lots of grass and other plant matter for animals to eat, and the animal population goes up and the animals put on fat. Then in the fall, the food available sharply falls. Since there's fewer predators around today, if there's no hunting, then many of these animals will starve in a horrific manner. This is the time the government allows people to hunt, and it controls the number of licenses and the cost and the number of animals that are allowed to be hunted. In order that the animal population stays stable and there's no overhunting. So for example, you could probably hunt one bear with a bear trap, which is a very easy way to hunt. But if you allowed people to put up dozens of bear traps and just leave them up all year long, you would get rid of all the bears in no time. The case of the Canadian native swift runner I talked about will tell you all you need to know about surviving in the harsh winter climates in places like Canada. And Canada is a very good stand-in for what the whole world was like about 12,000 years ago, and for very long periods before that. And in North America, the populations were very low when European explorers came compared to Central America. It's a really pretty harsh place when you think about it, if you actually go outside anyway. And to really make farming profitable in places like the United States, it required technology that came from Europe with the European settlers. Well, there's much talk about humans supposedly evolving in Africa. This comes from the anthropologist Stephen Jay Gould. He didn't believe in natural selection, and he wasn't a real scientist. And even if this were true, the climate was much different 12,000 years ago than today. The entire planet was much colder for uncounted thousands of years, and invariably, all bone isotope analysis shows that humans ate almost 100% meat. They did eat all kinds of things, but surprisingly, the ratio of meat compared to other things was even higher in humans than it was in wolves, or pretty much any other animal. Now that really surprised me, but those are the results. Even in classical Greece, this was the case long after agriculture was discovered. So yes, people ate meat, but it's also important to realize that they fasted. It's very difficult to hunt in winter because there's simply fewer animals to hunt. And it's also quite brutal and consumes a lot of energy. And while people have the idea that our ancestors lived in a paradise where living was very easy, it was actually extremely difficult. This is critical to understand because fasting is the only time your immune system fully activates. You can eat meat till the cows come home, but it's not going to release a single extra stem cell. It's not going to create a single additional T cell or Treg cell, which are the immune cells that are critical for fighting cancer and preventing autoimmune disease from occurring. It's also not going to regenerate your thymus, and without this you'll never make any T cells at all. And when you run out, your immune system simply stops working properly. You probably don't want to find out what happens then.
What do we do? We die.
A while back, there was some goofy controversy about Sean Baker's A1C scores being high. I would not get too worked up about blood tests though, because they're not really based on hard science, and it's important to realize there's no such thing as a health marker where you can just optimize the number to the right value and become more healthy. Aside from blood pressure, most of these markers are not really causative of anything at all. And even with blood pressure, getting it as low as possible is not going to help your health. You simply want to make sure it is not extremely high for very long periods. Same with blood sugar. If your blood sugar goes up high momentarily, it may not really be a problem, but if it's at 200 or 300 for years on end, then that's going to cause a really big problem. When people have values that are extremely out of whack, then this is often correlated to disease, but it's usually only a small degree of correlation, and for extreme cases. Cholesterol is a great example of this. I also want to say, because I see a goofy comment all the time that cholesterol levels don't measure cholesterol but phospholipids. That's not true. The phospholipids are actually made of cholesterol, and they're full of cholesterol. So I don't know what the point of this comment is, but if you see it, just ignore it. It's just someone being pedantic or misunderstanding reality. In reality, an 800 plus cholesterol level is only associated with a tiny increase in heart disease, and this is an incredibly high score that cannot be achieved through diet alone, but only comes from genetic abnormality.
However, by the early 1970s, even the American Medical Association had come in line with the others, the American Heart Association and the National Academy of Science. And all three organizations issued statements in the early 1970s that were virtually identical. These were official statements about diet and heart disease. The first thing these statements said was that Americans had cholesterol that was too high, and that it was important for Americans to lower their cholesterol. And they called for measuring cholesterol as a routine part of physical examinations, or even in early adulthood. So we want to make Americans anxious about their cholesterol levels at a very young age. We are instilling cholesterol anxiety in the population. Americans who were in the risk category should receive appropriate dietary advice, and Americans in the risk category should reduce their intake of saturated fats by substituting polyunsaturated vegetable oils. I put risk in quotation marks because they actually hadn't yet defined who was at risk. Were you at risk if your cholesterol was average at 240, or if your cholesterol was slightly high at 300, or if your cholesterol was low at 200? They hadn't decided who was at risk. So what I want to do now is look at three major studies that you all paid for. These were paid for with tax dollars, and these are the three studies that are mostly referenced in material that comes from our government promoting the lipid hypothesis. The first was the Framingham study that went on for 40 years in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, where they were looking at risk factors for heart disease. And when the results came out, this was in 1987, they were published in a major journal summarized in this graph. And it does look as though if your cholesterol gets up into this level, it starts to get pretty scary. and you look like you're, and it looks like you're quite at risk for heart disease if your cholesterol is in this interval or higher. Now, has anyone here ever taken statistics? Or sadistics, as my son calls them. Okay. Do you notice something strange about this chart? If you look at the intervals, the first interval is 121 points. It goes from a cholesterol level of 84 to 204. Okay? Then the next interval is 30 points, and then 30 points, and then 30 points. And the last interval is 830 points. It goes from 295 to 1124. Now, if you had done that on your statistics test, you would have gotten an F. This is cheating. This is cheating. And this was published in the American Heart Journal. So I redrew the chart, and I made the intervals equal, and now it looks very different, doesn't it? Yes, if your cholesterol's up here at 1,000, anybody in this room who has cholesterol levels of 1,000? It's very rare. It's extremely rare. You are definitely slightly more at risk for heart disease, but not very much. It's certainly not something to get too frightened about. And as you'll notice, inside this circle between 185 and 285, this is basically a straight line. That means you're no more at risk if your cholesterol is 285 than if it's 185. So why are we making these huge changes in our diet?
It's also notable that the average values of cholesterol at the time of this study were well over 200, yet the mentality of the medical industry today is to prescribe medication to push cholesterol down as low as possible, even though that was abnormal for the time. But since cholesterol is not proven to be causative of anything, there's actually no proof at all that this will improve your health or make you live longer, even in these extreme cases where they have 800 plus cholesterol levels. And we know that these medications have horrible side effects because they mess with your mitochondria and they make you unable to be anabolic, which is very important for many processes in the body. And the sad truth is that today it is not required to prove that a medication makes you live longer. You can get FDA approval and later find out that the drug actually shortens your life on average, which has happened many times now.
When you look at primary prevention, turns out the RCTs do not show any benefit on mortality. Do you know what the mean increase in lifespan is from treating high LDL with a statin is? 4 days. 4 days. None of these trials reduced CVD events, and some of the drugs actually reported harm. This just came out 3 days ago. And so you're looking here, at all-cause mortality, and this is the degree of LDL cholesterol reduction, and it doesn't matter if it's statins or ezetimibe or diet or anything else. That's your benefit. 0. On this side, we have number needed to treat. How many people do you have to treat with a statin to actually get one patient with benefit? 754. Ridiculous. Number needed to treat, maybe 10 might be cost effective. Really, 5 might be cost effective.
In reality, cholesterol, whether HDL or LDL, could possibly be considered a marker of good health. That's because metabolic syndrome drives down both of these factors. When I was over 300 pounds with extremely high blood pressure, my cholesterol was about 90. My doctor said my cholesterol was great, and they said I didn't have any issues with heart disease, even though I had really high blood pressure and had to be on 3 blood pressure medications. While doctors love to perform tests, and these tests are very profitable, you need to be very cautious in interpreting them. Just like cholesterol, I would not get wrapped up in your A1C scores or even your day-to-day blood sugar levels. It's really your liver that dictates metabolic health, and this is going to be much more important to see if you're actually healthy or not. And if you keep your carbs low and do some fasting, this will have an amazing positive effect on your metabolic health. That's because it's the liver that produces blood sugar for the body and absorbs the excess blood sugar when we eat. And if it is damaged or full of fat, it constantly shoots glucose out into the body. In fact, a fatty liver will also produce fructose and purines as well. The higher your ALT score is, the more of these very damaging substances your liver will excrete. This is the real main driver of gout in the body because it is the real main source of purines in the body, which are very difficult for the kidneys to deal with. ALT scores are another place where medical industry pseudoscience fails. Medical tests simply look at the population as a whole and look for values that stand out. It doesn't take actual physiology into account. This leads to a massive amount of normalcy bias. In recent decades, ALT levels have climbed dramatically, and this entire process is simply unhealthy. The ideal ALT level in the body is 0, because this process is triggered when the liver is overwhelmed trying to do its job. It can come from liver damage, a fatty liver, poor metabolic health, or simply from eating a large amount of carbohydrates before taking the test. The more carbs you have in the diet, the higher this score will be, especially when it comes to fructose and alcohol, which are processed by the liver in essentially the exact same manner. Both are very bad for your liver and therefore for your metabolic health. And the big issue most people have with carbs is the more carbs you eat, the hungrier for carbs you tend to get.
GN would constantly feel hungrier and hungrier. Noodles are made of carbohydrates, of which the more one eats, the hungrier they can get. Despite trying to be frugal with money, he started eating pounds of ramen every day because it was all that he had. 4 pounds a day, 30 days a month, over 100 pounds every month, and the more he ate, the hungrier he got.
Eating low carb is definitely going to help you avoid these problems, but coming back to Dr. Sean Baker and his A1C scores, this might not be for the best in all cases. The reason that the A1C went up was not that his blood sugar was up, which is impossible on his diet, but because these cells were surviving much longer due to having properly formed cell membranes. This is generally going to be a good thing, but it is not necessarily a good thing when it comes to damaged immune bodies. You want these cells to die off and be replaced over time, especially if you've been exposed to something like chemotherapy or other chemicals that damage them. This includes spikes, by the way, whether they are natural or artificial in nature. Having damaged white blood cells is something you absolutely, positively do not want. Since we all accrue damage to our immune cell bodies over time, we need to fast to renew them. The human body is designed for this, and it simply requires it in order to be optimally healthy. Phototherapy is also going to be a great help here. It can switch macrophages from the pathogen fighting mode to the mode where they repair damage to the body itself.
Now the mechanisms, there's quite a few different mechanisms. The main mechanism revolves around the mitochondria. So the cytochrome C oxidase, which is unit 4 in the mitochondrial respiratory chain, is accepted as a chromophore for red and near-infrared light. And the idea is that you get more oxygen consumption, more ATP, the mitochondrial membrane potential goes up. Other things happen, but one important thing is that the mitochondrial metabolism switches from glycolysis back towards oxidative phosphorylation, which is important because it has a few effects on the whole metabolism. You get a lot of signaling happens based on this mitochondrial activity. You get nitric oxide released, you get ATP and cyclic AMP, you get a brief burst of reactive oxygen species. These activate transcription factors, so June Phos is AP1, I kappa B allows NF kappa B to go to the nucleus, and these transcription factors can trigger the expression of over 100 different genes, which is a long-lasting effect. So these proteins that are triggered by these transcription factors will last for hours, days, and even weeks. So a single exposure to light can have long-lasting effects. As I said, this switch of glycolysis to oxidative phosphorylation is important for two reasons. One is that stem cells are activated. Stem cells in their hypoxic niche carry out glycolysis, but when the mitochondria are activated, they need oxygen, so they have to get out of their niche when they can undergo proliferation and differentiation programs. The second effect of this glycolysis to OXPHOS switch is anti-inflammatory. So macrophages have an M1 phenotype and a pro-inflammatory carry out glycolysis. When OXPHOS is activated, they switch to the M2 anti-inflammatory phenotype. And if these happen to be microglia in the brain, they can undergo phagocytosis, for instance, disposing of amyloid plaque that clogs up the brain tail. But we did discover quite a few interesting things about how shining light on the head has beneficial effects. And we've summarized them in this diagram here. So there's a lot of different processes here, and there is positive evidence for all of them, actually.
When they are fighting pathogens, these macrophages are the primary consumers of NAD+ via the CD38 enzyme. All of those guys trying to sell you expensive supplements like NMN don't realize the real root cause can be addressed through fasting and phototherapy with red light and near infrared. In fact, I've had some of these guys push back against me very hard and say I was a liar and so on because they don't want to believe that's true, even though I've showed studies many times that prove it, because that's how they're making their money. And if you don't fast, your NAD+ is always going to be draining away regardless of what you take. So you can use NMN or niacin, which works just as well and is much cheaper to prop it up, but it's slowly going to dwindle over time. And also keep in mind that taurine helps here with NAD+ as well. People always ask me for specific foods to eat. They want to eat a berry or pepper and become magically healthy, but it really doesn't work that way. The best that most of these exotic foods can do is give you some more antioxidants. And that's why I do take some bilberry powder every day. But in reality, the main reason people need antioxidants is because the carbohydrates and PUFAs in the diet cause ROS, which cause damage. And you're always going to have some of these bad byproducts, but limiting the carbs and PUFAs in the diet is going to dramatically reduce this. So eating a low-carb diet of mostly meat addresses these problems because you consume fewer carbs and you produce less damage. And you also produce more glutathione. That's because meat is heavy in methionine, which is required to create glutathione and taurine in the body. Without a diet with lots of protein, we're pretty much guaranteed to be deficient in methionine compared to our ancestors. Don't supplement methionine or NAC though. If you want to increase glutathione and taurine, it's much better to supplement taurine, L-cysteine, and glycine. This will be cheaper, have better results, and also drive down your homocysteine levels because your body doesn't create that as a byproduct anymore because you're getting it in the diet, so you don't have to break up that methionine. While you can technically get all of these nutrients from meat, it is largely contained in parts of the animal we seldom eat today. When it comes to our diet, it's largely what we don't eat, and then it's making sure to get enough nutrition, especially when it comes to methionine, taurine, glycine, and many of these essential amino acids or conditionally essential amino acids that most people just don't get today. Basically, we need to have a diet that's similar to what our ancestors ate to be healthy, which should be totally unsurprising. And at the same time, how we eat matters a lot. We're designed to have periods without eating for self-repair, and it's impossible to totally repair ourselves if we don't do that. Otherwise, our immune system spends all of its time fighting pathogens, And it also never clears out those old immune cells that are getting damaged and senescent. And that's also why guys like Dr. Walter Longo, the oncologist, have found that fasting has a great effect on undoing the damage of chemotherapy. You're getting rid of those damaged cells, whatever their source is, and there's lots of sources of damage today. While phototherapy can address many of these problems, fasting not only produces new stem cells and new immune bodies, but it regenerates the thymus itself. This is because fasting dramatically stimulates growth hormone in the body, which has been shown by Dr. Greg Fahey to regenerate both size and function in the thymus.
What got us started is this observation here that we all have this master gland of the immune system, the thymus gland, but unfortunately for us, by the time we're 30 or 40 years of age, almost all of the functional mass of the thymus is gone. And that's unfortunate because we need that thymic functional mass to make T cells that defend us against infectious disease and cancer. And I roughly estimate that after the age of 50, at least a third of us die as a consequence of that involution of the thymus. Next scroll, thank you. So there was evidence that we could actually regrow the thymus, and so we decided to do a clinical trial back in 2015 to 2017. And we found that, yes, indeed, we could, based on MRI imaging of functional thymic mass, we could regrow functional thymic mass in people up to the age of 65. And in fact, we could see reappearance of new thymus manufactured cells in the bloodstream and a disappearance of certain senescent T cells, which are making way for the new ones that are coming out. We also saw a sign of reduced inflammation, which we were hoping to see, reduced prostate cancer risk indices, and even changes in hair color in a few of our people. Scroll, please. And with respect to hair color changes and things like that, that sort of suggested a general anti-aging effect. So Steve Horvath ran 4 different epigenetic aging clocks on our volunteers and showed that in every case, aging seemed to be going in reverse, at least based on the output of those clocks. Later on, Steve went back and had another look at the data based on a completely different metric, which is the plasma measurement that we were just hearing about, the plasma pheno-age clock of Morgan Levine, and found the same thing. Next scroll, please. So for that reason, we decided to go on to see if we could replicate those results. So we're calling the new trial the TRIM-X, the extension of the original TRIM trial. We're dividing it up into different tranches. The first one is A, which we've completed as of this month. We don't have all the data in yet, but it's beginning to show some signs of replicating what we saw before. The aged population is about 8 years older, but epigenetically they're the same age as the original TRIM population, so they're a different kind of kettle of fish. We saw a little bit of hair darkening, but not as much as what we saw in the TRIM trial. But we have seen improvements in prostate cancer risk, a decrease in CRP, and the immune results and the epigenetic aging results will probably be in by the end of this month, but unfortunately don't have them yet. But we do have data in on the plasma pheno-age clock. And in the original TRIM trial, about 51% of the people responded positively in that regard, although all of them responded positively in terms of the epigenetic aging aspect. We see the same proportion of responding positively in TRIM-X-A, so that's encouraging. Next slide, please. So I just had to throw this in. So Steve Horvath volunteered to be a partial treatment control in our group, and he was taking DHA metformin but not growth hormone. I was taking DHA metformin and growth hormone. His statistical results were not there. Mine were. Don't know if that means anything, but it's interesting. It kind of suggests that we can reproduce some of the results from the TRIM trial. Next slide. So some new things that we're seeing in TRIM-X-A, increase in lymphocytes, both absolute and percentage. That correlates with reversal of plasma pheno-age, but we did not see that in controls, only in the treated group. Next slide, please. We also saw some new things. So we've confirmed that in people that enter the trial with a high carbon dioxide level in their blood, it goes down. That's suggestive of improved lung function. We have made a limited number of measurements on people who have gone through exercise training at our campus, and we've seen a 25% improvement in VO2 max on average with a high statistical significance, again, suggesting improved lung function. Next. And going along with that, we're finding improvements in muscle strength, both in men and women, as you can see down here, and in exercise tolerance as indicated by the lactate threshold. Improving. This gentleman up in the right corner entered the trial at the age of almost 81, and a little while later he started enrolling in 5K races and started sending us his times. And I think if we started doing linear regression through those times, we'd see that it keeps going down, and he says, well, I beat my record, I didn't even try. So we may have some more objective data that come out of some of these subjective reports. Next slide, please. Another thing that we saw in addition to the improved exercise capacity, muscle strength, et cetera, is a 14% decrease in the total body fat percentage.
The growth hormone you get is not bioidentical today, so if you're getting it from a pharmacy, you get lots of side effects because it's not actually growth hormone they're taking. It's just very similar. That's so they can patent it. And it's also important to realize that taking it exogenously from a pharmacy is going to make you very insulin resistant. So this is a problem with this strategy. Aside from the cost being incredibly high, it's like $50,000 or $60,000 a year for all this growth hormone, but it has an amazing effect, and you can get the same effect through fasting. And when you do it through fasting, you don't get the insulin resistance problem because your total IGF-1 is not going up extremely high like it's going to if you inject this stuff into yourself. And when your thymus is healthy, you're able to produce new T cells and Treg cells, which most elderly people simply cannot do. So they're taking things that damage these cells and destroy them, and at the same time they can't replace them. So it's no surprise that suddenly all these people are getting cancer, or they're suddenly type 1 diabetic, and they're totally baffled why all this is happening when it's actually pretty obvious. And these cells can only be deployed against one specific threat, then they're imprinted forever to fight only that threat. So even if you're perfectly healthy, eventually you just run out of these T cells. And if we're unable to make new ones, we can't fight off any new threats, then a cold comes along and whisks you away to heaven. And this applies to pathogens, immune reactions, autoimmune reactions, inflammation in the heart from certain reactions, or tumors too. So you're going to see cancer developing very rapidly as you get to be 80, 90 years old. So you really don't want immunosenescence, but you definitely don't want it when you're 50 or 60 like people are getting it today. It's your immune system that keeps you healthy. Aging is really a disease of immune decline, but we can slow this process down quite a bit. You don't have to eat zero carb, but a diet limiting your carbohydrates, and especially PUFAs and fructose, and that's rich in methionine, taurine, choline, glycine, and all the other micronutrients that we find in meat that are just not talked about at all. Phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, and on and on and on are all things that we need in the body. We also need to fast too, which will actually repair some of this damage. And we also need phototherapy, or we need to spend a long amount of time every day in the sun, which is also not all that practical for most people. Otherwise, our mitochondria are not going to be healthy, and our macrophages are not going to be healthy. For most people, it's probably a really good idea to supplement taurine, glycine, L-cysteine, and TMG, and this is going to keep your liver healthy, minimize homocysteine levels, and increase glutathione production in the body. Currently, I take 6 grams of taurine and glycine and 1 gram of TMG and L-cysteine every day. People want a list of everything that I take, but it changes all the time. I might do a video on that someday, but I'm not going to sit there and type out 25 things every time somebody asks, sorry. Especially when I'm not 100% sure what the exact levels I want to have for the future are. Now, you can't put off the Grim Reaper forever, but if you understand how our bodies are designed to operate, then you can really give him a run for his money.
We will travel to the ripsticks, where you will place a coin.
Not today, matey.
In the mountain.
Remember, only the good die young.